Okay, so I know I'm late to the party, but the Age of Scorpius and the situation with Milo Winter has been living rent-free in my head for like 6 months now. It's already been talked about by a ton of different people from a ton of different angles, but I want to talk about one specific part of all of this, and that is the persistent comment that the Age of Scorpius reads like a 12-year-old wrote it. I'm going to approach this in kind of an unusual way. I'm going to show you the actual unedited writing of an actual tween, namely my actual manuscript from when I was 13. We're going to see how and why it parallels the Age of Scorpius on a line level, and then I'm going to talk about the path I took as a writer after I wrote that manuscript. If you don't know what I'm talking about, here's just a very brief overview. An indie author now known as Milo Winter went semi-viral on TikTok while marketing his debut novel, The Age of Scorpius. He managed to sell around 6,000 pre-orders and used that pre-order money to establish a creative studio, which was basically just a cohort of artists making book and fan art for his novel. There was a lot of social media drama surrounding that move, which compounded when the book came out at like the end of June 2025, because when people actually read the book, it turned out it wasn't good. Like, the story was underbaked, the world building was lacking, and the prose was amateurish. Milo initially defended his work, then changed tactics and decided to release an edited second edition. But after a whole bunch more drama, he canceled that release in February of this year. Before I go any further and get into the thesis of this video, I just want to say that everything I say here is my opinion. It's not established fact, just my best interpretation of what I've seen. I also want to say that this video isn't for Milo Winter or anyone close to him, so if you're one of those people, probably don't watch this. I don't have much interest in publicly dogpiling on Milo, but I am going to be speaking critically about certain specific aspects of his writing and my own. You should also know that I'm not going to talk in depth about most of the drama, and this also is not going to be a deep dive into the entirety of the Age of Scorpius. Instead, I'm going to talk about that specific comment, that the Age of Scorpius reads like a 12-year-old wrote it. If you're interested in text deep dives, I'd recommend the videos by the SBU English Club, The Queer Reader, Reads with Rachel, and Cheat Sheet Productions. There are several other people that have given this great coverage, but those are the ones that immediately come to mind. Full disclosure, I haven't read the whole book, just the first 2 chapters, which are publicly available via the World of Guardian Patreon, the free version of it. My understanding of the story as a whole comes from the aforementioned creators. But from what I have read and my understanding of the plot, I think that The Age of Scorpius does read like a 12-year-old wrote it, and reviewing my old work to make this video has given me confirmation of that. Thankfully, unlike a lot of very young writers, I kept fairly good track of my work from the time I was about 13, so I have a manuscript that's just shy of a decade old to start with as a direct comparison to The Age of Scorpius. The samples that follow from my later teens and early 20s are a good way to show the actual progression of another young writer. I'm not going to give a ton of personal background, that's not really my vibe, but I will give you enough context to understand where my writing is coming from in comparison to Milo Winter. I started trying to write novels at around the age of 8, and my manuscripts cleared the 40,000 word mark around the time I got to middle school. I mostly wrote sci-fi and fantasy, which are my home genres to this day. I can't find any of my pre-8th grade work, but that's fine, the timeline works out because I'm currently 9 years removed from that. In comparison, Milo Winter has stated that he started working on the story that would become The Age of Scorpius when he was 12, and he published it at 22, with a lot of drafting in between. It's been noted by a lot of other creators that Milo Winter probably doesn't write very much outside of the universe that The Age of Scorpius is set in, and that it's likely that he counts his previous drafts as separate books when he talks about his writing experience. If that's true, in spite of the similarities in our writing timelines, there's a big difference between the way Milo and I learned to write. I didn't write one book over and over, and I didn't write in a single universe. I wrote the manuscript I'm about to share with you, which is a standalone modern world sci-fi murder mystery, along with 3 historical urban fantasy novels, a sci-fi book about aliens in the late 1940s, a parallel world dystopia about soulmates, a future world fantasy dystopia about telepathic dream reading, an excessively long literary fiction novel that made me realize I liked writing romance and hated writing literary fiction, a feminist military sci-fi novel set about 300 years into the future, and I actually wrote about 3/4 of a sequel to that one, but I don't typically add it to the count because I never finished it. And my most recent novel, which is definitely the best of the bunch. It's a Star Trek-esque space opera romantic comedy. That's not an exhaustive list, and I actually think I'm missing a few, but suffice it to say, I've written a lot of different books in similar genres. But they're all very different stories, usually set in different worlds. I very rarely recycled characters or plot beats. If I do, it's typically just the surface of something, like reusing a character's name or their physical appearance. Being generous to Milo, I think this stems from the difference in what kinds of writers we are. Milo writes for his world, I write for my characters. Being a little less generous to Milo, I think this might be because of what Jolie Black talked about in their video, that Milo seems to write as a method of expressing his paracosm. While Milo and I are both neurodivergent, we don't have the exact same diagnoses, and I don't have a paracosm. Ironically, I actually have dyslexia, and reading the Age of Scorpius was very difficult. But aside from the paracosm aspect of things, I'm a lot less invested in world building generally, and more invested in character work. That's not knocking authors who are world builders first. I've been known to enjoy Brandon Sanderson, but I can see a world building author having a harder time moving on from something like the Age of Scorpius. Whereas I was mentally and emotionally free to jump from book to book without feeling the need to keep everything in the same universe or rework a specific story, it seems clear that Milo did not feel or act that way. Jumping around in my writing, changing genres, and experimenting with radically different processes for different books taught me a lot. In all honesty, the hands-on experimentation and failure of several attempts gave me a lot more of my functional writing knowledge than I got from repeating the same methods, stories, or genre work. Now, I'm going to get to the actual writing. I'm going to read the first 500-ish words of the Age of Scorpius so we have a solid understanding of the style of the prose. For non-writers, that's about 2 pages. The Age of Scorpius, Chapter 1. Someone had rewritten the history of Conviction Woods, the cursed forest I called home. Despite all the texts describing Conviction Woods as eternally inhabitable, there were hundreds of wartime artifacts scattered amongst the forest's grounds. The records had been altered to hide the truth of Guardian's last war, a truth that allowed the woods to protect those mysteriously meant to survive beyond its boundaries. I lingered on the edge of the farthest northern reach of Conviction Woods. Before me stood a crumbled and dilapidated stone arch, old runic etched across its surface, worn away by the structure returning to the earth. A few fallen stones lay scattered across the surrounding ground, freezing into the dirt as ancient remnants conjoined with snow and soil. Beyond the arch's gaping mouth laid Assiduous's barren territory. Assiduous's barren territory, and its occupants who didn't want me meandering on their land. It was too late for me to trace the rest of the runic on the arch. I'd only recorded the lower carvings, my arms too short to reach the tallest stones. I let my eyes linger on the writing to try to memorize the patterns. The clock ticked as enemies neared, and while my feet drew me away from the arch, my mind bent around the writing. The archer's inscriptions must have been centuries old. I'd never, in any of my studies, seen a combination of Union languages on an artifact. Mixing 2 Union languages was almost unfathomable to modern-day society. Besides our common tongue, Guardian prioritized the separation of the 4 Unions: Conviction, Assiduous, Autarkic, Societal, in their own societies and territories. Even more intriguing, the arch dated back to a war where Conviction and Assiduous were enemies. A combination of the 2 languages was further proof that Guardian's recorded history was wrong. I had spent months scouring over records, libraries, and books to pinpoint the location of the arch as soon as I spotted it mentioned in a 300-year-old document. My research eventually revealed that the arch was placed in the Ascidian territory on the edges of the woods at the border, though that could have spanned hundreds of miles from the eastern part of the hub, Guardian's shared centralized city, to the coastline of the continent. To trace the steps of ancient battles to the coordinates of the arch was a tedious process requiring my nose to be stuck in at least 24 scrolls within the past couple of months. Deciphering the runic on the arch was my next step to decoding the true history of Conviction Woods, and the moment I finally found it, an Ascidian border patrol just had to be there, of course. There was no doubt about it. The two of them had spotted me. I'd stepped past the 10-foot wide path into Ascidian territory where the arch stood, and they were headed straight toward me. So, right off the bat, there are a lot of issues with the prose. The thing that immediately hits me in this opening is that it lacks a character anchor. I know that sounds like an odd thing to say because it's told in first person, but that first-person narrator hasn't been defined. It's essentially just a disembodied voice in a white room telling us a story that we don't have a personal connection to yet. There's nothing to grab you into the story and help you relate to the world or the plot because you don't have a strong point of view character set up yet. It's as if the book assumes you already care about it or are already immersed, even though you've just picked it up. The next thing is something I think even a non-writer could spot as a problem pretty quickly. The setting is not clear or immersive. We get a little bit of scene description, but the setting is not shown to us through a point of view character. The narrator, who eventually we learned is named Rika, notes snow, but says nothing about how the cold feels to her. She notes that she's unable to reach the top carvings on the arch, but doesn't describe the sensation of stretching to reach them, that kind of thing. The scene description that we do get ends up lost in the surrounding info dumping. There's one section that really stands out. It reads, "Mixing two Union languages was almost unfathomable to modern-day society. Besides our common tongue, Guardian prioritized the separation of the four unions: conviction, assiduous, autarkic, societal, and their own societies and territories." This amount of world-building exposition is something that could maybe be effectively folded in later in the book, once the reader has been given a reason to care, but I think it would take a very steady hand in order to pull it off at any point. At the very least, it doesn't need to be here. It kneecaps the opening before it has any real chance to start. Now there's the issue of action. Because this scene is overburdened by exposition and also lacks an immersive setting and an anchoring point of view, the actual sequence of action in the scene gets buried and becomes indistinct. From what I can tell, our point of view character is examining a stone arch that she's already taken rubbings of on the edge of a place called Conviction Woods. Her study of the arch is interrupted by two soldiers on patrol, who are in danger of finding her and force her to flee. But that's not what comes across as important in the scene. Instead, we get a top-heavy, meandering world-building dump with some ineffective setting description, and absolutely no effective characterization of the point of view character to anchor it. There's one more big issue in this scene that I see, and it's the one that I think actually matters to this video's topic, i.e., the way that teenagers write. All of the previous issues are mistakes that a sophomoric or even intermediate writer of basically any age could make. But the last one is probably the one that leads to this feeling like it was written by a 12-year-old. And that's the mechanics of the sentences themselves. This problem is really two separate issues, confusing syntax and, let's say, overzealous diction, but they're intertwined to the point that they're basically inseparable. Here's a good example of this problem. The second sentence reads, "Despite all the texts describing Conviction Woods as eternally inhabitable, there were hundreds of wartime artifacts scattered amongst the forest's grounds." To me, this seems like an attempt to prove one's writing competence via heavily atmospheric or quote-unquote beautiful prose. The issue is, beautiful prose has somehow become complicated prose. That's a misconception that a lot of young writers have, and a phase that a lot of us go through, myself definitely included. It's true that a beautiful sentence is sometimes complicated or put together in an unexpected way, but it takes an extremely skilled writer to pull off an extended number of complicated sentences like this, and they all have to work. This sentence doesn't work. The choice to say eternally inhabitable strikes me as tonal. There's a desire to use the word eternally because it has a specific atmospheric implication, but it fails to land because the sentence itself has an unclear meaning. This line would have worked better if it had gone for a simpler structure and simpler diction. Something like, in spite of the wartime artifacts that I had discovered scattered throughout the forest, Conviction Woods was commonly thought to be uninhabitable. That edit fails to correct a lot of obvious problems in this opening, but it's a clearer line. It still shouldn't be where it is in the text, but if this line has to exist in some form, it should be more straightforward, even if it comes at the expense of this little bit of atmosphere. Okay, I'm done breaking down the opening of the Age of Scorpius now. It's not exhaustive, but it's enough to give us an idea of the text on a line level. Now I'm going to do something embarrassing and read you the opening of a book I wrote when I was 13. I want you to keep all of the problem areas I pointed out in the Age of Scorpius in mind as I read it, and see how many you can spot in my writing. I think it's probably all of them, and maybe a few other problems as well. Chapter 1. Thunder. That was what woke me up, which is shocking, considering that the last time something other than my alarm woke me up, I was still in high school and didn't have the insomnia that I do now, and I didn't have to take sleeping pills just to get a few hours of peace where my mind wasn't running in circles. I sat up, the bass roar of thunder making the walls of my apartment shake as I groggily rubbed the grit out of my eyes. I pushed a hand through my hair and reached for my lamp. I flipped the switch, but the bulb stayed dark. The power was knocked out, and I was awake. Great. The street lamp outside was dead as well, judging by the pale, false daylight of lightning that went unchallenged as it streamed through my window, throwing the shadow of running water from the window onto the wall. I picked up my phone from my nightstand and checked the time, the harsh bright light blinding me before I could turn the brightness down. 3:23 a.m. I silently cursed the universe as I put my phone back and collapsed on my mattress, squeezing my eyes shut and striving to keep the howl of the wind and the fury of the rain and thunder from sending me into the suddenly unlocked vault of my memories. By the time I usually woke up that morning, I was already wide awake and almost out of the door. I had a bagel in one hand, with butter, not cream cheese because cream cheese is disgusting, and an umbrella in the other as I approached my door. My power was still out, and my apartment was dark due to the dismal conditions outside. Alright, thanks for sticking with me through that. That's just the first 300 words, but that's basically the quality of the prose from there. Like I said, the problems here are similar to the problems in the opening of the Age of Scorpius, but not identical. Firstly, there's some backstory dumping going on in the second line. Way too much exposition is given about the main character's history of insomnia. Secondly, we once again get through the first 300 words without knowing the main character's name, though we do get it shortly after the end of my sample. This isn't a deadly sin, but in my writing now, I do try to avoid that. Thirdly, the structure and especially the length of the sentences is overdone. It's trying too hard to be impressive. That second sentence, the one I already pointed out, is 59 words long and not skillful enough to support its own weight. Additionally, there are some pretty glaring word choice issues. For instance, the harsh bright light blinding me before I could turn the brightness down. The use of bright and harsh and blinding is redundant. A good rephrasing of this sentence, which originally read as, quote, I picked up my phone from my nightstand and checked the time, the harsh bright light blinding me before I could turn the brightness down, unquote, would be, I took my phone from my nightstand to check the time, flinching at the brightness before hastily turning it down. Another instance where 13-year-old angst really shines through is in the sentence, I silently cursed the universe as I put my phone back and collapsed on my mattress, squeezing my eyes shut and striving to keep the howl of the wind and the fury of the rain and thunder from sending me into the suddenly unlocked vault of my memories. Again, this section is overlong, and it's also rather overdramatic, considering the narrator is in his 20s. In my opinion, the melodrama isn't just conveyed in cursing the universe, but in the phrases, howl of the wind and the fury of the rain, and the suddenly unlocked vault of my memories. It's trying too hard to be emo and mysterious. A lot like the choices of eternally inhabitable in the opening of Age of Scorpius is trying too hard to be ethereal. Hi, editing me here. I just want to say sorry if there's a change in audio quality. I don't have a ton of free time, so I recorded the first part of this whole thing on one day, and then I had to restart on another day, and it is the morning, so my voice has a little bit of a different tone to it from here on, so just a little warning. And one more little disclaimer, I really don't do this, so I'm sure the audio quality is going to be bad. I'm just recording on my phone, so if you get background noise, I really apologize. I tried to get it as quiet as possible, but I'm sure there's background noise. Back to our regularly scheduled programming. Now that I've shown you a real example of a novel opening that was actually written by a literal 13-year-old, I think I have provided some convincing evidence for the argument that the Age of Scorpius does in fact read like it was written by a tween. I'm not going to belabor this point anymore, but I am going to give my answer to a different question. When your writing looks like this, where do you go from here? The Age of Scorpius is actually the result of 10 years of one kind of writing. From my vantage point, it's a reflection of a lot of the things we've already talked about, namely Milo Winter's tendency to write in only one world and focus on variations of the same story, his refusal to edit existing text, which we know because he has stated that when he edits, he just rewrites cover to cover, and a clear inability, or at least extreme difficulty, taking critical feedback. What I want to show you with the rest of this video is another version of where about 10 years of a different kind of writing can take you, even if you start when you're literally a tween. I seriously hope that Milo himself isn't watching this, because I honestly would rather not make anyone feel like they're being dragged. But I do think this might be helpful for anyone who saw the Age of Scorpius situation unfold and is realizing, oh shit, I write like a teenager. That's because writing like a teenager isn't a death sentence for your craft. It's not even a death sentence for Milo Winter's craft. I think, if anything, he's going to be more hindered by the fact that his first impression as a writer has been this. Now I'm going to show you my version of almost 10 years of writing, the actual unfiltered ways that my writing has changed from the age of 13 to the age of 22. I'll talk a little bit about small, relevant aspects of my life and education, but I'll say now that I'm just a random voice on the internet. I like to write. I'm fortunate enough to have had an extremely rigorous undergraduate education, and I have publishing ambitions, but I'm not a genius, and I'm not an expert. I haven't edited any of the following samples for this video unless I explicitly say so. They're in the state I found them in when I dug through my old Google Drive. That means that a lot of them are effectively first drafts, or even zero drafts. After finishing the manuscript I just shared, notably not editing it, briefly querying agents, and getting resoundingly rejected, I wrote some other stuff. I can't remember what exactly came next chronologically, but I think this next sample is a good illustration of teenage writing evolution. I was either 15 or 16 when I wrote it. It reads, "He rolled into town like a hot summer's day. Engine so loud and gasping it stirred people from their homes and made them all wonder who the stranger was and what reckoning he would bring. Blackbirds flew from their nests in the redwoods and cried as they flew over the San Lorenzo Valley, and if he had been a little less earthbound, he would have looked like one of them. They trailed him as he shot up Highway 9, at once following and fleeing. And then he was gone, passing me on the side of the road so fast that my clothes fluttered. I could only squint into the wind after him. The smell of the wild cut through with the sound of the train whistle from Roaring Camp. Damn hippies. All want to go to the Garden of Eden, and they don't give a damn about who they run over on their way, an old man complained to his equally crotchety wife. They then proceeded to carry their groceries to their 2-ton car and become safety hazards. You really think he's going to the Garden of Eden? The shop boy who was setting up a fresh chalk sign outside of the grocery store squinted up the road after him. Nah, wrong direction, I replied. And I doubt someone wearing that much leather is down to strip naked and get baked with a bunch of dudes with fleas. Ew. I have to be perfectly honest. I had to do so many takes to get that text sample recorded because I completely forgot how this opening ended with that comment. And it made me laugh so hard that the one that you just heard is the least giggly version of this recording. I apologize for that narration. So, if you couldn't tell from this opening, this was after I had taken an ill-taught high school poetry class. This runs into a lot of the same problems as before, and some of them to an even more obvious effect. Overly flowery setting descriptions that I can't pull off, failure to place the narrating character as central to the scene until after the first 2 paragraphs, run-on or near run-on sentences. We do get some more subtle personality injected into the narrating character's description earlier on in this scene, specifically with the comment about the old couple getting in their car and becoming safety hazards after complaining that a motorcycle rider was a safety hazard. It's not masterfully done or anything, but this is better indirect insight into the point of view character. He is aware of the irony of the scene occurring around him. I'm not going to get into this one too much more, or the next few, just for the sake of time. But I do think you can see that most of the problems are still here, and almost getting worse in some regards, as I got smarter and started to think I knew what I was doing and that I was an extremely profound author. In the overconfidence, this draft reminds me even more of the opening of the Age of Scorpius than my actual 13-year-old writing. At some point relatively soon after this book, I wrote an anthology-style follow-up with a similar soft fantasy premise set in a different time period with different characters, but in the same broad universe. I'm going to read a slightly longer section from this one because this is a much more successful opening. I'm almost certain that I wrote it, or maybe rewrote it, when I was 17, during my senior year of high school, which also happened to be a COVID year, just for a time check. As far as editing, I think this is the second version of this novel, but I wouldn't say it has been edited in any really meaningful adult way. The car door closed sharply, and I hit the pavement. My dad let go of the back of my shirt and dropped my backpack. It caught my shoulder as it went down, but I was busy registering the heat of the asphalt, like nothing I had ever felt before, burning my skin through my clothes and melting my shoes. I stared up at him, blinking spots from the desert sun out of my eyes. He paid me no mind. From inside the car, Isabel shouted my name, but my head was ringing. My mom shushed her anyway. He turned away from me, back to the car, climbing into the driver's seat with a set jaw and a thin mouth. "Wait," I croaked, dry mouth. Then my eyes widened as I realized what was happening, and I scrambled to my feet, burning my hands on the pavement. "Wait!" The car door closed again, and he pulled back onto the highway. He hadn't even turned the engine off. My legs got the better of me, and I took off running after him, ditching my backpack on the side of the road like I could catch up with a car doing 60. My heartbeat was unsteady and my shoes were sticky, and I ran for too long before my breath disappeared. I was left standing in the middle of the road in the middle of nowhere, saying, "No, no, no, please." I stared after them until the only thing left was a spot on the horizon, and then nothing at all. Oddly enough, my first thought wasn't that they were gone, and it wasn't that I had been abandoned. Instead, it was, my glasses fell off. Maybe if I put them on, I'll be able to see them. But I looked a second longer, turned in a full circle, registering the flat, baking nothingness all around me, the mountains in the distance, and the hellishness of the sun. Then I turned around to go get my glasses. My hands stung. They were burned and scratched in places. Within a few seconds of walking in the direct sun, my whole body throbbed in time with my heartbeat, and sweat ran down my back, only to evaporate instantly. Like I said, this opening is a lot more effective. Ironically, I think I was able to achieve this level of effectiveness because I cared about this story less going into it. I wasn't hung up on exact word choice or perfect atmosphere. I was just trying to get the story onto the paper. I actually think that this approach would help someone like Milo Winter a lot. When you write in a very relaxed way, especially for a first draft, which you then have to edit, I find that it can help you avoid the tangled diction and melodrama that sometimes happens when you're overly invested. I don't have any recommendations for how to achieve that state because it's pretty personal, but I found a method that has helped me a lot. If anyone is nervous about getting their opening right, I'd recommend that you do whatever you need to do to circumvent that anxiety and just start. Otherwise, you might end up writing eternally inhabitable and thinking it's the gem of the literary canon. Let's talk about specifically why this piece of writing works and compare it to our other samples. The biggest change from the other openings is that this scene is primarily concerned with one event and is anchored by action. The narrator is being hauled out of the car, dumped on the side of the road, and abandoned. The action is clear, and compared to the Age of Scorpius and the two previous samples of my own writing, it's uninhibited by world-building details or excessive atmospheric description. There's fixation on the heat and the desert setting, but it's tied more effectively to the experience of the narrator. Additionally, sentences are much shorter, which makes them more effective in an action scene. There are also fewer thesaurus words and listed adjectives. It's still not a perfect opening. Some edits that I would make now would focus on giving the reader more of a reason to care about what's happening to the narrating character and trimming down on the setting focus just a hair. The narrator's voice is stronger here because it's more intentionally restrained, but I'd like to see it tweaked just slightly. If I was writing this now, I'd hold back and let loose more in different places. In any case, this is a big jump in quality from the last draft, mostly because it's not trying as hard. It's holding back a lot and being more strategic about when to employ literary devices and skills, instead of throwing everything at the wall all at once in no particular order and waiting for something to stick. This next sample is from the last novel I wrote before I turned 18. There's, let's say, a lot going on here. I never edited or even redrafted this manuscript, and while there are small elements of the story and characters that I have continued to use in my adult writing, I think it would take me several years and a few degrees of skill improvement for me to be able to pull this concept off. I'm just going to read this opening to show you what I mean. The human was standing in the middle of the field, looking up at the moon. The place where I had landed was dark, devoid of too much city light to see the stars, and the world was tinged green by the death throes of the setting yellow sun. The human was so intent on something in the sky that it didn't notice the long grasses all around me rustling as I scuttled along the surface of the earth. With urgency, I forced myself along until I reached its feet, obscured in the grass. I crawled onto the toe of its shoe, but it didn't react until I was climbing up its leg, trying to avoid its flailing arms as it reached to pluck me off of its sides and back. It let out a soft shriek when I reached the bare skin of its neck, and it felt my legs. It flailed more dramatically, hands narrowly missing me as I darted to the base of its neck and clenched. This book had a very high concept involving dual narrators sharing the same body, along with text formatting being used to convey voice differences. The story and settings themselves were also a lot. I was in way over my head, and I think I actually knew that when I was writing it because I never even tried to query agents for this book. I won't go over this sample too much on a line level. Other than that, I think the biggest flaw in the opening is that the narrating character doesn't have any established emotional stakes or even an emotional state other than urgency, which isn't very engaging. It's a fascinating scene, but it could use a little more character emphasis and maybe slightly less description. It does have pacing going for it, though. It's very quick out of the gate. The next opening is from a manuscript that took me a super long time to write because I was in undergraduate school and I had very little free time. If you're keeping track of age progression, I was either 18 or 19 when I finished writing this. It's high fantasy dystopia. The main hall of Temple Kairen was set for 1,000, and the crowd spilled out into the city streets. The overhead lights, wired in the pattern of the stars, dimmed, and hush rushed over the hall, from the altar to the open back doors. The near-total blackness of the darkened city fell upon them, and they stood in rapt religious silence, waiting for something to tame the void. From above, in the balconies, the crowd's shifting in the darkness was still clear through the eyes of my mask. I waited, side by side with the other readers, until they became still. Places, a voice crackled through my earpiece. As a unit, we took an inhale and one thunderous step forward, lifting long black candle lighters into place. With a spark and a collective roar of heat, fires lit instantaneously in the braziers in front of us, far above the onlookers. In this manuscript, I reverted to some of my previous bad habits. Too much focus on scene description, not enough character emphasis up front, fixation on ambiance, that kind of thing. I restarted this one a few times, mostly because I was so busy at this point in my life that I kept losing track of where I was and had to keep starting over. Given time, I don't think I edited this very much, but more than a lot of the previous drafts I mentioned. Before my 20s, I really didn't know how to edit beyond a vague idea of rereading and line editing text, so that's what I mean in this instance. There was no developmental editing or a serious understanding of deep text revision, and I would say that that shows in this book as a whole. The next sample is from the only literary fiction I've ever written when I was 20. This manuscript is absurdly long. It's nearly 150,000 words. It was the last thing I finished when I was in undergraduate school. Just for reference, I graduated a year early, so that's 2 manuscripts in 3 years. And it was more of an exercise than a serious attempt at a viable, publishable novel. In spite of not being very good, writing it taught me a lot. Through this, I learned that I don't like writing literary fiction, that I do like writing romantic storylines, and that I need to avoid belaboring all of my personal emotional experiences in a single work of fiction. I think that's a lesson that Milo Winter could stand to learn in his writing as well. I don't say that as a condemnation. Writing is cathartic. Writing this overdramatic novel was cathartic. It just didn't lead to a great story or a great reading experience. You'll be able to see why very quickly. The fresh earth of the grave was black, the kind of mud that could have been ash. It matched my suit and ruined my shoes. Rain dripped from the ends of my hair. I reached up to brush a short strand back and winced as the bandages around my ribs strained. My finger brushed the abrasion on the side of my face. Still unhealed. They wanted to have it quickly. They wanted to have it without me. I stared at the dirt and forced myself to breathe against my broken ribs. In and out and in and out and breathe and breathe and breathe. Like giving birth. Like dying. My body was only that crack in my skeleton and the places where I leaked. Blood, tears, air. Breathe and breathe and breathe. Rereading this, even 2 years later, I have a much different perspective on this writing than I did at the time. I think half of this works all right, and half of this is too much. It reads like funky, amateurish, freeform poetry. It needs to back way the hell off. But there are some descriptions here that are actually doing some decent heavy lifting, namely the mud, the strain of bandages, and the detail about the ruined shoes. I'm really glad that I wrote this book, even though it will never see the light of day. That's because this manuscript marked a turning point. Somewhere around the middle of the book, I started to realize that restraint was what was helping my bigger lines hit harder. I still had a ways to go until I found the right balance, but by the end of this book, my line level writing had gotten a lot better because I knew how to pull back. This was a realization that I came to in large part because of my academic life. In my real life, I'm a visual artist, and it was around this time that I absorbed the technique of catching the eye by intentionally varying texture and detail quality. Through my past examples, we've moved forward chronologically until reaching the approximate age when Milo Winter would have been writing the actual published version of the Age of Scorpius. I have 2 more samples of my writing to share, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on them because Milo and I would have been writing them at almost the exact same time or at almost the exact same age. I have publishing ambitions for both of these samples, and because of that, I'm going to change the character names, and I might omit or change very small world-building elements, but I'm going to leave the rest of the line-level text as it is. While all of my previous work has been only minimally edited or redrafted, these next 2 have both been properly edited, though I did use very different techniques for their writing processes, and I think the second one worked a hell of a lot better than the first. Before I share these, I want to give a disclaimer. I could very well be another Milo Winter. That is to say, a young writer punching above their weight class and not realizing it. I genuinely hope that I'm not, but if you think that I am, or if you, person watching this, are a young writer realizing that you're out of your depth, I think that the thing to keep in mind is that you can always get better. I've already mentioned it, but I have a background in rigorous academic art settings, where the foundation of the learning process is peer and professor critique. It served me really well in a lot of ways, but I think the most important might be that it helped me separate the reception of my art from my worth as a person. It has also taught me that art of all kinds is something that is learned. It can always be improved, and it is also collaborative in many ways. You might be the person behind the easel holding the brush, but you can use the eyes of all of those around you to make your work better. Am I stalling sharing my newer writing? Yes, I am. But now I'm out of excuses and out of disclaimers. So here's sample 1, written between 20 and 21. Jane smiled at me in the halo of the street lamp, orange light glowing on the curve of her smooth black hair like the searchlight of an alien spaceship. The light bent to her will, painting her in quiet, chilly summer nights and the goosebumps we tried to ignore. My face ached from smiling. A transport ship glided through the atmosphere above us, golden running lights aimed toward Alameda. Jane spun beneath it, hair bouncing, and threw her hands up. "Beam me up, Scotty," she giggled. Her laugh was like wind chimes in mid-morning, the best way to wake up. I pushed a hand through my cold hair. The world was reduced to textures, denim and cotton, and the shape of my breath made visible in the night air. "They don't use those kinds of transporters," I said. Jane rolled her eyes. "Does it matter?" "I'm very particular about my Star Trek trivia," I joked, flopping down on a sidewalk bench. "When an alien ship crash lands 2 farms over, you do your research." "Really? Is that why you became a high and mighty engineer?" She sat down next to me and elbowed me. "Yeah," I flushed, crossing my ankles and tapping my toes together, too nervous to meet her eyes. "Did you get to see the ship?" I shook my head. "No, but my mom used it as an excuse to throw spoons at the sky." Jane looked confused. "Don't ask," I advised. She pinched my arm, then leaned her head on my shoulder. God, I love that you're from the middle of nowhere. My heart fluttered and my breath came short. You love that my relatives are a bunch of hicks, even by Terran standards? I asked, shakily. My face was red. I think I just love everything about you, Sarah, she said. Again, not a perfect opening. This is a middle draft with moderate editing, and I'm not remotely done with this story. It's on a back burner for now. One of my biggest problems is on display here yet again. I don't start with the main character in the scene. I get closer, though. It's still a little description heavy out of the gate, but it's not as bad. The dialogue gets started quickly, there's a strong emotional tone for the narrating character, and tension in the scene. The narrating character clearly has a crush, and there's obviously some romantic energy between the two characters. The problem that this manuscript suffered from were more structural than line-oriented, though there were fixable line issues that I have left on display here. If you're curious, the structural issues were mostly because of previous ideas having holdovers in the end product that I had a difficult time excising, an issue that I do think Milo Winter exhibits in the Age of Scorpius. That's why this story has been on the back burner for me for almost a year. I think it needs at least a few more years of distance before I can make it what it needs to be. In the meantime, I'm going to write other things and improve my craft more. I know this video has already been so long, but we've arrived at the last piece of my work that I'm going to share. This one was written and edited between 21 and 22, just shy of a decade removed from the first piece that I shared. I was almost exactly the same age writing this that Milo Winter would have been when he wrote the currently published version of the Age of Scorpius, which ironically meant that I was writing this when the book came out and the backlash began. I also have to say, just as a very last note, that I'm really glad that I made this video, even if it's just a shout into the void. It had a really positive impact on me because going through a lot of my old, very flawed writing, and also through the Age of Scorpius, in perfect honesty, made me realize that I needed to rewrite this opening. So I took like a fourth or fifth crack at it, and I completely reworked the scene. And it works better than what I had previously. So the scene that I had previously, it wasn't bad. It still worked, I think, on a lot of levels. But this one is definitely better. So, in a very weird way, I think I need to say thank you to Milo Winter, because without him and without the Age of Scorpius, I don't think I would have made this little bit of progress on this opening. John and I were watching each other, and we were both pretending we weren't. I held my breath, waiting to see who would make the first move. My fingers twitched. John took the bait and slid his pawn into action, lightning quick. I countered almost before he was done. Alteran chess moved fast. The corners of my mouth quirked as he made a frustrated noise, rerouting. I never should have played you, Elle. You never should have challenged me, Hadrian. We traded moves, hands nearly brushing at each attack. The Valiant was flying through a nebula, and the pink light from the lounge windows tinted the board and the translucent pieces. He practically handed me his knight, then shook his head in dismay. You're such captain material, Elle. I felt myself begin to fire flush, golden light sparkling on the crown of my queen. Stop trying to distract me, Octavius. Is it working? He took my bishop. It's unfair. I think I need an advantage. Maybe we should have had an audience for this, since it's going so well for you, I said. We were alone in the lounge. We were always alone at this time of night. Don't tease me, he begged, but he was smiling. John had a very nice smile. The skin around his eyes crinkled and his irises glimmered, more blue than gray. As if he sensed me staring at him, he looked up from the board and winked at me. I lost my stride and fumbled my next move, accidentally giving him an opening. Check, he announced happily. I glared at the board. Are you hustling me? I would never, he lied. I paused for a few precious seconds to consider. John and I almost never played Alteran chess. I hadn't exactly underestimated him. I just didn't know how to estimate him at all. He picked up one of my captured pieces and turned it over in his left hand, a nervous gesture. I could feel him watching me again. He drew in a sharp breath, like he was going to say something, then stopped. I chanced to look up, and he averted his gaze quickly. "What?" I asked. "Nothing," he said, like he was deciding on the word as it came out of his mouth. I moved a pawn, frustrating his attack. It was his turn to study the board, still fiddling with my bishop. "I was just thinking about the night we met," he said, examining his offense. "Do you remember?" "How could I forget? A space Roman in a bar." He clicked his tongue disapprovingly. I hate that joke. Alright, that's the last one of mine. It's heavily edited and still actively fights my tendencies to get stuck on setting, but I hope it's miles better than where I started at age 13. I certainly like it a lot more. And just so you get some perspective on what I'm comparing this to directly, here's the first page of the Age of Scorpius once again. Someone had rewritten the history of Conviction Woods, the cursed forest I called home. Despite all the texts describing Conviction Woods as eternally inhabitable, there were hundreds of wartime artifacts scattered amongst the forest's grounds. The records had been altered to hide the truth of Guardian's last war, a truth that allowed the woods to protect those mysteriously meant to survive beyond its boundaries. I lingered on the edge of the farthest northern reach of Conviction Woods. Before me stood a crumbled and dilapidated stone arch, old runic etched across its surface, worn away by the structure returning to the earth. A few fallen stones lay scattered across the surrounding ground, freezing into the dirt as ancient remnants conjoined with snow and soil. Beyond the arch's gaping mouth laid Assiduous's barren territory. Assiduous's barren territory and its occupants who didn't want me meandering on their land. It was too late for me to trace the rest of the runic on the arch. I'd only recorded the lower carvings, my arms too short to reach the tallest stones. I let my eyes linger on the writing to try to memorize the patterns. The clock ticked as enemies neared, and while my feet drew me away from the arch, my mind bent around the writing. I'm going to try to avoid making sweeping statements about my skill as a writer in comparison to Milo Winter, but I do think that the opening I just shared is working better than the opening of the Age of Scorpius. Keep in mind that it's a different genre, a very different story, and that we are stylistically very different writers, but also take in the mechanics of the sentences themselves. Given the feedback that I've gotten on this piece of work, I think it's relatively safe to say that my line-level writing does not typically read like a 12-year-old wrote it anymore. Mostly. There are still sophomoric, ill-fated aspects of my writing that I'm working on, but I've had a very different trajectory in the past decade of my writing than Milo Winter has, and it's led to very different outcomes. I say that in order to emphasize, again, that while it is hard to improve your writing or stop sounding like a tweenager, it is possible. In fact, I think it's probably easier to make that leap the older you get because you're more capable of analytical thinking. I'm sure that there are people out there who overcame this issue way faster and more effectively than I have, regardless of whatever age they started at. I think that the Age of Scorpius drama scared a lot of young writers. And I mean that in the sense of writers who are both young in age and who are young in their careers, trying to get off the ground. It definitely scared me. Most of the production of this video was just taking a really hard look at my writing and picking it apart for flaws, trying to be as honest with myself as possible, because I don't want to end up with a debut novel that gets roasted on the internet. I'm not expecting my debut, whatever it ends up being, to be a smash hit like Old Man's War or Ancillary Justice, but I want it to be good. I think Milo Winter wanted his book to be good, too, because we all do. It's natural. But there's something I've realized that I really need to keep in mind as I keep going and hopefully one day get a novel published. And that's my ability to handle criticism. There's something that Milo said a few times in various places during his controversies that really stuck out to me. That he writes differently because he writes as an art. I think that that statement indicates a massive misunderstanding of what art is. Once again, my background is in visual art. I'm not going to go into detail, but I'm very good at my discipline, and I don't say that lightly. I'm also going to say, very seriously, that I've gotten as good as I have by learning to listen to people when they say that something isn't working. In Milo's case, I think he probably has a hard time with that for ego reasons, which is understandable and normal. I had a hard time with it when I was a teenager and had to grow out of it very quickly when I got to college. The technique I use to change my mindset is pretty effective, and I want to offer it to anyone that might need it. I try to see a critique as the critics and I working together to fix the problem in the art, instead of seeing the class as telling me what is wrong with me. There has to be a very careful, calculated separation between art and artist if you want to be able to digest criticism without it breaking you. Furthermore, that approach only works if you understand art as a discipline. It's not just about creativity, inspiration, or profound beauty, as Milo seems to imply in this statement. Or at least that's how I read it. It's about methodical practice, dedication, and above all, skill. When you have that perspective, criticism seems less dire because you know that you can improve with enough effort, time, and resources. Sorry, that's probably a different video, if I ever make another one. Thank you for anyone who listened this long. I know that this has been a super long video, and again, that I'm late to the party. I've been considering making this for a few months now, and I finally got a minute to do it once everything is basically resolved, for my own fascination as much as anything else. If I make more videos, they'll probably be writing, reading, and editing oriented. Let me know what y'all would think about a video outlining how I developmentally edit the Age of Scorpius, because I have some ideas. Thanks for watching. I'll maybe see you again.